Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Conference on Asian Pacific American Leadership's Washington Leadership Program. My name is Billy Lim, and I chair the Board of Directors for CAPAL. The Conference on Asian Pacific American Leadership is a nonprofit organization that builds Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander public service leaders by providing formative professional experiences and growth opportunities. It is my pleasure to be kicking off our Washington Leadership Program with you today. WLP is one of our signature programs that introduces students to Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander leaders in public service who can inform and inspire students' own civic engagement. Our WLP theme this year is reflection and resiliency, of communities to come together and catalyze momentous change through these unforeseen times. Through these sessions, panelists and attendees will reflect upon events leading up to 2021, emphasizing how communities unite, reflect, and demonstrate unyielding tenacity and resilience, even in the face of uncertain and demanding circumstances. WLP sessions will be recorded and live streamed to our Facebook page and will be available later afterwards, including the materials. I would like to welcome you to today's session, Deconstructing AANHPI, Disparities and Inequalities within the AANHPI community. This session will focus on the complexities and disparities that exist within the AANHPI community. Key topics will include perceptions and implications around the umbrella term AANHPI, varied experiences, identity building, and ways in which to encourage and build greater bonding and a sense of community among AANHPIs, which we know is so important. Follow us and join our conversation tonight on social media using the hashtag #WeAreCapal. You are very encouraged to use that hashtag. Let's get others to engage, to see that these conversations are happening and to join us not just now, but for future sessions. There will be a short survey that will pop up after we close the session, and we greatly appreciate your feedback. If you could please stick around and fill that out, we would so appreciate that. And with that said, I would like to begin by thanking our speakers and panelists this evening for spending their time with us, and to you all for joining in. And a very special thank you to our 2021 sponsors for making programs like tonight's possible at CAPAL. Tonight's program will consist of an audience poll, a panel discussion, and Q&A. Please submit any questions you have into the Q&A box, and we will close out afterwards. Now, I am pleased to introduce our wonderful Programs and Operations Associate, Hannah Park, to set the stage for our panel with an audience poll.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Billy. Thank you so much for attending our first Washington Leadership Program series this year. My name is Hannah Park, and I am the Programs and Operations Associate at CAPAL. We are truly excited to launch into this series, and we can't wait for you to hear from our panelists and engage in some discussion afterwards. So with that being said, before we head into the discussion, I would like to ask for the audience if you would like to take a few moments to participate in a quick Zoom poll, which I will launch shortly. And these questions are to serve and to gauge your own perspective and opinions about some of the topics that we will be talking about tonight. And I would like to note that you can answer these questions anonymously. So I will pause here and give a few more minutes for you to fill out the poll. And I would also like to note that if anyone has a question or comment at any point during the webinar, to please submit your question in the Q&A or the chat box. All right, so hopefully that was enough time to fill out the poll. So I will be pulling up and sharing the results now. So as you can see here, before we launch into the discussion, the reason that we did do this is because a big topic and issue that we'll be covering today is the term AANHPI and what it means to be part of the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community. So these questions are to gauge for yourselves, the audience, to see where we fall in certain issues and perspectives, and to reveal a little bit about where we are all coming from before we begin the discussion. So I would like to share that, interestingly, the majority do agree that we have a strong idea of our identity as an AANHPI. The majority agreed that we felt a strong connection to their AANHPI identity and community. A lot of people strongly agree that the term AANHPI should be further distinguished, and then coinciding with that, the majority disagreed that a cohesive AANHPI identity exists. And closing out with, the majority did agree that they do tend to identify more with their specific ethnic and cultural background than as AANHPI. So with all these statements and perspectives in mind, I will now hand it off to Billy to introduce our speakers.
Fascinating poll results. And a very, very, very rich place to start this session from. Thank you for that informative activity, Hannah, and I'm so excited to hear more on this in our panel. Now it's the moment we've all been waiting for. Please give a warm welcome to Seema Agnani, who will be our moderator for this panel. Seema will be leading the discussion and the Q&A. Seema is the Executive Director for the National Coalition for Asian Pacific Americans Community Development. She has more than 25 years of experience in community development, capacity building, and immigrant rights. She was a founder and Executive Director of Chaya CDC, working in the South Asian community of New York City, and also coordinated the Fund for New Citizens at the New York Community Trust, a donor collaborative focused on immigrant rights in New York City. Seema, I'm handing it off to you.
Thank you, Billy, and thank you, Hannah, for organizing this wonderful event. I really appreciate CAPAL bringing us together, and hope all those participants have a wonderful program ahead. Really looking forward to this discussion with my fellow panelists. I work with them on a regular basis, so it's great to have the opportunity to pull over and reflect on what has happened in the last few months, really. And think about what we need to do moving forward. So thank you for this opportunity. So yes, so much has happened. I think since last summer, with the uprisings that really began in Minnesota, the attacks on the Asian American community specifically, more recently, rise in hate incidences, and of course, the fact that we just closed Asian Pacific American Heritage Month really has put a spotlight on our community, and specifically our identity. So I'm sure many of us have been thinking about these issues in the recent past. So we want to start off with a general question for the panelists, and I want to ask you all to introduce yourselves. Name, preferred pronoun. I didn't do that myself, she, hers. What does the term AANHPI mean to you? Is it an identity that you identify with, or more, do you identify more with your own specific ethnic identity? So I'm going to ask each of you to respond to this one. Kam, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Seema. Hi, everyone. My name is Kam Moa. I am the Director of National Policy at the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center. We're a nonprofit organization and civil rights organization based in DC, but with an office in California. And we've civil work specifically around the Southeast Asian American community, specifically those from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. So what does the being AANHPI mean to me? Very, rather, not that much, actually. The AANHPI label for me has always been a political label. It's a label that we coalesce around in order to build political power, because our communities are, scattered across the country and, may not have a strong enough political base in places like North Carolina or Wisconsin if we don't coalesce under an umbrella, quite honestly. I identify as a Hmong American. That's the cultural background I have. And, if I was to compare, if there was any sort of pan Asian Pacific ethnic identity I relate to more, it's broadly Southeast Asian. I think that for me, rings closer to home than AANHPI, just partially because it's a mouthful, AANHPI. But secondly, because I think it's hard to identify as AANHPI when a lot of the media work, a lot of the the voices and the stories that are told are not my own, are not reflective of the communities I'm from, and are so distant from me. I was born in a refugee camp. My parents are refugees. Most of the people in my communities are refugees, and it's hard to go to anti-Asian an anti-hate rally focused on Asian Americans, and to hear all these wonderful speakers talk about their stories as immigrants, as people who came over to the US through an employment visa or through family sponsorship, and be like, okay, I can't relate to any of this, right? Like, this just isn't reflective of my people and our experiences. And, for me, like, that's part of the reason why, the identity is very important, but it's important politically and not culturally, or really to my identity as an individual.
Thank you. I saw some heads nodding. Sina, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Seema. Hi, everyone. My name is Sina Wipi. My pronouns are she and her. I am the Policy Associate for Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, virtually based in Washington, D.C. Usually they're in person when there's not a pandemic going on. Currently in California, more specifically Tongvaland in Los Angeles, Southern California. EPIC focuses on leadership development, research, and advocacy. Let's see. I feel like I get asked this question all the time. So the term AANHPI, I think very similar to what Com has shared, it is very much a political term, especially for Pacific Islanders. It's a term that was created pretty much without our consent. And I do want to recognize and acknowledge, our Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander leaders, who came together, right? Like during I think it was not too long after the Civil Rights Movement to really to answer the call of the urgency of all of our communities not being represented in any space, especially the political space. So I do want to acknowledge those leaders, but at the same time, like, there's always been Pacific Islander erasure in that term. And so it's something that a lot of my community and myself that we still struggle with. But more specifically, what I do identify is a Tongan woman, and most Pacific Islanders would identify as more of their ethnic backgrounds too. I think even just Pacific Islander, I think that's more, it makes sense to, use that term in like policy spaces or anything in national spaces, but even just in the context of my own community, even that term was created without our consent. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Sina. Kieran?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Kiran Kaur-Gill. I'm the Executive Director of SALDEF, the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund. We're a national Sikh American advocacy group based out of Washington, D.C. And I would echo my fellow panelists. I think for me, I identify like as first as a Sikh American, and that's sort of how I've experienced things here growing up, and where I identify culturally. Sikhs are is a religion, we're a minority religion both here and in India. So in addition to having the cultural association, there's a religious association as well. So I think that does make it distinct. And we also have articles of faith that make us distinct as well, you know, both here in the United States and abroad. That being said, I think I've come to sort of understand the term AANHPI a little bit more and maybe appreciate a little bit more. Like my fellow panelists said, you know, the term came about, you know, in regards to solidifying political power, around organizing, around sort of, you know, getting our groups together. And Sikh Americans, again, are a minority group. So I don't think we've ever had the opportunity to be a majority anywhere. So we do have to you know, be in partnership and solidarity with other groups and work together to get things done. So I do think there is, you know, some positive to it as well, and things that have been accomplished. The Sikh American experience in some ways mirrors other groups. Sikh Americans came to this country in the late 1800s. We had periods of immigration. So similar to some of the other Asian Americans that worked on the railroads and the lumber yards in California on the West Coast, we do have Sikh Americans that had similar experiences there. We had Sikh Americans that came over, you know, that were denied citizenship in some of the exclusion acts. We have Sikh Americans that came over as professionals in the 60s and 70s. And we have Sikh Americans that came over when they were, you know, politically persecuted abroad as asylum seekers and as refugees. So we really do have members of our community that span different immigration experiences. You know, as recently as last year, I visited a facility in Chicago that housed unaccompanied minors, and we had 150 Sikh youth in that facility. So we really, you know, I think broadly the community has experienced a number of different things, and also just this idea of, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later as well, this perpetual foreigner, you know, not really, even though some of us have been in this country for over a century, never really getting to claim in some people's eyes, you know, this identity as American.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we touched on this already, all of you did, in terms of whether the term, well, does a Pan-Asian identity exist? You know, before we move into the NHPI portion, you know, the Pan-Asian identity itself was also something, I assume the roots of all of this are in the census of how our communities were put together. You know, Karen, you started to talk about some of the benefits or positive sides of us working together as a community. Maybe if others can come, maybe you can speak to this a little bit, you know, sort of what are the benefits of us working together on the political side? Yeah, if you can start there.
Yeah, you know, there's power in population size, quite honestly. I think if you know, look at the Latinx community, I think it's a really good example of, you know, how politicians and corporations pay more attention because of because of the size of the population. And I think for Asian Americans, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, you know, the beauty of us working together under this umbrella is that it helps us build a much larger coalition, which is why when people ask me about AANHPIs, I'm like, we're always working in coalition, always. Because, you know, quite frankly, there's maybe like 320,000 Hmong Americans who live in the US. You know, their populations are concentrated in like Fresno, California, in Minnesota, Wisconsin, you know, but that means that there are like 47 other states where they have no strong political sway. You know, part of being able to work together means that under the AANHPI umbrella, it allows us to tap people in like Texas and Florida and make a case for why they should care about AANHPIs, because the hope is that the AANHPI communities cares about the different issues within our broader, within the many different subsets. You know, I think was it Frank Wu who wrote that book, Yellow, about how Asian American is made? And you know, I think there is validity, there is an Asian American identity. I think, you know, certainly when people look at AANHPIs, they don't think, oh, well, you're you know, Tongan, or you're Chinese, or you're like, you know, Vietnamese. It's like, oh, you're Asian, right? So I mean, I think there is a perceived Asian identity for sure, and then I think there's a political Asian identity, and then I think, you know, there are other complications with it. So it exists. There are benefits to it, but I think certainly there are also many downsides to it too. You know, as Southeast Asian Americans, like, we're not oftentimes in the rhetoric or the stories of Asian America. You know, I think oftentimes it's a very specific kind of narrative that doesn't include Southeast Asian American voices, or if it does, you have a very token Vietnamese voice. And the other, you know, narratives and stories really aren't shown or seen or reflected in that identity and in that conversation. And this is reflected more broadly in the politics of the community as well, and in the way that we are, you know, we've, as a movement, tried to push elected officials to be more responsive, to our communities. We see a lot of our issues also not being included. You know, although there isn't to say that there hasn't been a good faith effort and that we haven't made progress, we certainly have. I think on the other end of the spectrum, you know, we've also seen, like, you know, different administrations and different government agencies also, you know, stifle progress under the Asian American umbrella. You know, sometimes, you know, data segregation is a really good example of this. You know, they'll say, well, you have Asian American data, right? But we all know Asian American data in the aggregate isn't good enough, you know, but it, you know, it's also being used to stifle efforts to progress the needles on a number of the issues that we work on as well.
Thank you. So, I mean, you know, in the last few months, I'm sure this is the case for all of us, you know, all of a sudden we're getting a lot of phone calls and emails from corporations, you know, donors, which is good, but also, you know, a lot of statements being put out by different corporations to really stand up against anti-Asian hate, and it has a very strong East Asian focus in many cases, or is being led by East Asians within those corporations, is my sense. And but they're still using the term AANHPI. You know, what are the repercussions of this? And you know, if we use that broader term, but we really are speaking to specific parts of our community, you know, what are the repercussions on all of our communities as a result from your perspective? Sina, I'll start with you this time.
Thank you for the question. I think the repercussions of using the term AANHPI is that there's generalization and assumptions made, and just about our broader community as a whole. And there's rarely ever any NH or PI voices in those narratives, you know, especially if it's, you know, pertaining to Heritage Month, because to me, every month is Heritage Month for Pacific Islanders. And so when it does, you know, when it does come to May, you know, it's one of our busiest months out of the year as an organization. And so we get pulled in so many different directions. And it's a challenge, and it can be exhausting as well, because that's what we do every month anyway. It's just more of that during APAM. And I think just to speak to, really wanting to acknowledge the hate crimes and xenophobia and racism that has happened with the Asian American community. I think there's definitely been harm in assuming that Pacific Islanders are also experiencing that same harm, when that's not necessarily the case. I don't want to take away from, Pacific Islanders who are mixed race with Asian American or Asian descent, but at the same time, that can be really harmful, because we experience, violence and racism and hate in very different ways, and so those stories are not always told.
Yeah. Karen, you want to add your thoughts here?
Yeah, so it has really been an interesting time for the Sikh American community. On the one hand, you're right, there has been a lot of spotlight on the recent hate crimes against Asian Americans, and I agree with Sina. I think it's important to sort of, identify, the different groups and who's experiencing, targeted hate and violence, and also acknowledge the different experiences of sort of the subcategory of the AANHPI community. For Sikh Americans, we've experienced this type of violence for years. I mean, you can go back to the late 1800s, but obviously, the spike in hate crimes against our community, really, it really increased around 9/11. And we saw a number of, Sikh Americans that were attacked, that were killed. SALDEF did a survey last year, actually, on the Sikh American experience, and 58% of individuals, Sikh American individuals, have experienced discrimination and harassment, and over 60% that keep the Articles of Faith. So that's more than half of our population, and this has been going on for years. So when we're spotlighting it right now, it's sort of, I think in a way it's good that corporations and different agencies are aware that this is going on. And I think from the Sikh American perspective, we want to help and be part of that conversation. We are, I would say, the unfortunate experts in some way of having experienced this type of violence and hate for so long, and to really build in community and and work to combat this. So I think that's sort of the way that I look at it, and I've been part of a number of conversations around AANHPI Heritage Month, and and with the recent shootings. And I really, it's an odd feeling to be coming to this conversations as an expert in this area. I don't want to say an expert, but somebody that has a lot of experience, and the organization has a lot of experience, because it's literally something that the community has been dealing with since the inception of most Sikh American organizations.
Yeah. Yeah, when the pandemic first hit, I couldn't help but go back to post 9/11. I was working in New York City with Chaya CDC, a predominantly Muslim population, and immediately thought, knew that this moment would come when the rhetoric from the White House really was emerging at that time around the virus itself. But what it really did was also move me to think about, what does violence really mean? And, in New York City, Bangladeshis, which is the population that Chaya was serving primarily at that time, they have the highest poverty rates in New York City of any other ethnic group. And, poverty is another form of violence. So, I think the complexity of our community is really a challenge, and the diversity is also, of course, a great strength. But, I guess thinking about, each of you has pointed out the nuances and differences among our communities and, those disparities that do exist. I guess, how else what are the origins of these disparities, and how do they affect the way we as communities interact with each other? Anyone want to start with that one? I'll put somebody on the spot. Com, you look like
I can take a first look at this. I think one of the things to look at is immigration patterns. I think, the ways in which Asian American and Pacific Islanders have come to the US have been so very different. And we have come in, many, many different ways. Like there are major nuances, for example, within the Chinese American community, for example, right? Those who came prior to the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act and those came after, for example, or, the fact that a majority of Southeast Asian Americans, didn't choose to immigrate to the US. They were resettled after, US military intervention in the region. And, I think looking at how we have come to this country and where we came to this country from is a really big indicator of where our communities are and why there is so much discrepancy and so many disparities within our communities. I mean, if you look at the data, Southeast Asian Americans have some of the highest poverty rates, some of the highest limited English proficient rates, some of the lowest educational achievement rates. They have overcome so much, right? Overcome war, famine, genocide, trying to integrate into this country, but there are still many different hurdles. And I think a lot of it can be attributed to a combination of migratory pattern and then the US policies at the time in terms of how we are able to integrate. So for example, the US policies at the time with regards to refugees was to heavily disperse Southeast Asian Americans across the country in order to force assimilation. And so that's why you didn't see ethnic enclaves pop up for Southeast Asian Americans until later in like the 90s and like the 2000s, even though these communities came to the US in like 1975 and earlier on, because the policy at the time was to keep them separated so that they can learn. But it's hard to do that when, a significant portion of Cambodian Americans who came to the US are genocide survivors who were mostly female-led households because their husbands were killed in the genocide, who had very limited educational opportunities prior to coming to the US, compared to the first wave of Vietnamese Americans who, were, highly educated individuals who had some English proficiency, connected with the US military. Hmong Americans, for example, 90% were illiterate when they came to the US. They couldn't speak or read English. They were, well, not illiterate, limited English proficiency at the time. They had very little education, formal education compared to other populations. And I think, that and the way that it sets them up in this country is very different to, someone whose family came over through an employment visa system, who came in with some sort of job opportunity, who had some formal education, who had some sort of, income coming in. So I think that, really speaks to the different disparities within our communities, but also speaks to the diversity of the experiences within the umbrella.
Yeah, thank you, Com. Sina, you wanna respond to this?
Yeah, sure. This is definitely a loaded question. So thank you, Com, for for starting us off. I think very similarly, it's very important to understand the different pathways of migration that Pacific Islanders have made their way to the US, especially if that was never part of the plan. I really, when I think about the origins, I think about colonization. I think about military the militarization, heavily militarization occupying our Pacific Islands. I think about the bombing of US military bombing the Marshall Islands in the Pacific. And even to this day, a lot of those communities that are the Marshallese folks are still feeling those impacts of the radiation from those bombings, because they have really, really bad health disparities even to this day. I think about land desecration, right? And so a lot of these things that happened we were kind of forced to leave our islands. And so to give you an example, my grandfather, my dad's dad, he was living between Tonga and Samoa for a very long time. He had land in both islands, and he was in Samoa. He had a lot of land and he had his own plantation. He gave it all up to come here to the US. And when he came here, he was mowing lawns. That's how he was making his money, because he came for us, for my dad, his siblings, for us. Now he has more than 10 grandkids who are college graduates. I don't think he ever anticipated that, but I think he believed in this country that much that, it would help our family. And so when I think of abundance, right, in the islands, we have an abundance of everything that we need, right? And we come here, we live in food deserts. We have an abundance of fast food restaurants around us, right? And and a lot of our communities are in low income neighborhoods and are also, have like poverty, live in the poverty, at the poverty level as well. So, when I think about the COFA community, the Compacts of Free Association, which include the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of Palau, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands, they just got Medicaid restoration in December of last year, 2020. That was a 20 plus year long fight, which many of our AA and NHPI organizations helped to advocate for, and also a lot of our COFA leaders as well. But why did it take that long, right, to have access to basic healthcare? So there's so many different pathways of how our different communities got here, and really experiencing a lot of health and racial and housing and economic inequities along the way.
Yeah, thank you. If it's okay, I'm going to move on because I feel like we have about 10 more minutes and I want to get to these important next questions. I think in terms of the access to healthcare, I'm glad you started there. Sina, if you could say a little more about how these disparities have played out during the pandemic and, in terms of the Pacific Islander community's access to, testing, vaccine, and I know that the infection rates have been disproportionately higher. So yeah, if you can say a little bit more about how that, why that is and how those disparities have really played a role in that.
Yeah, so just pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, these health disparities in the Pacific Island community, like heart disease, diabetes, obesity, they've always existed for such a very long time. And so COVID just made it so much more worse. In the states that do disaggregate data, which is probably 19 to 21 states, I want to say, there have been over 50,000 NHPI COVID cases, and then probably over 800 deaths. And this is all as of last month. A lot of the information that we've gathered so far is because of our own community. It's not something that, local government or state or even federal is handed to us and told us, this is what the numbers say about your community. These are things we had to fight for during the pandemic, both at the local, state, and federal level. Like the data that is from NHPI Data Policy Lab out of UCLA. That's something that we had to fight for. And, you know, as far as access to getting vaccinated and, you know, outreach, education, and information, we're hiring our own folks to get the word out, but also making sure that things are translated into our languages, and that we make sure we reach out to our young people to make sure they're helping their parents and grandparents out. I took my parents to get vaccinated. I would not feel comfortable if they went and did that on their own. They wouldn't even know what to do, right? And so those things are really important, and those things are the things and stories that people don't see too often when they look at our community as a whole and what they think the narrative of our community is. There's a lot of things that people don't fully understand, and so it's part of our role at EPIC is to fill in those gaps, because we center our community and because we know we want to be there for our community as well.
Yep. Kieran, how has the pandemic affected the Sikh American community? I know, I feel like the shootings in Indianapolis also brought light to the fact that many of our communities are essential workers, as well as Atlanta. You know, how has this played out in the Sikh American community?
So I think you did, you touched on a great point. There are many in the Sikh American community that are essential workers. We saw, obviously a lot of Sikh Americans that worked at the FedEx facility in Indianapolis. A lot of Sikh Americans are in trucking. They're in the, they're on the front lines, frontline workers. And so we have seen, increased COVID cases in our community. One thing I shared at the beginning, which is sort of interesting about our community, is that we really have Sikh Americans that came to this country in many different ways. So, for example, the community in Indianapolis is more recent immigrants. So Sina was talking about in-language support. I mean, it's critical specifically for certain, certain Sikh American communities where there's newer immigrants, where there's less English proficiency, to have those resources in language, to have that support. And that's where a lot of the orgs end up coming in, because even though the populations are large, and Indianapolis actually has a fairly large Sikh American population. We have 9 houses of worship just in Indianapolis itself. So that's fairly large for a community. There weren't individuals that could, speak to the community in language, resources both around, COVID, also around hate crimes, and in the aftermath of Indianapolis. I mean, that was lacking. And I've had conversations with agencies and with police departments and with the FBI and DOJ and the like about sort of the lack there. But I think really, for our community, because of the different experiences and where they are in the country, and sort of where they are socioeconomically, there has been differences in their experience with the pandemic as well.
Yeah, thank you. Kam, you want to share more about the Southeast Asian community?
I think with regards to COVID, it's really hard to parse out the exact impact on Southeast Asian Americans because we just don't have the data, quite honestly. And, even though anecdotally we know that there has been a significant impact in Southeast Asian American communities, we are hard pressed to have statistical support for our stories. I will say that, where there is data available is in Minnesota, where one of our partners, the Center on Asian American Leaders, was able to, disaggregate Asian American data and the impact on AAPIs in that state. And what they found was that of the Asian Americans who were COVID positive, over 50% of them were Southeast Asian. They were either Hmong, Burmese, or Karen. And then where they found, they also found that they had higher rates of death, being placed in the ICU compared to other Asian American populations, and to the general public, quite honestly. I think we've been trying to make this case for a very long time, with, HHS and with the CDC, with Congress, with local governments, about the need for them to disaggregate the data. But because they're not disaggregated in data, it's hard for us to really identify the exact toll that COVID-19 has had on our communities, even though we know that it's there. Especially, because over 50% of Cambodians and Hmong Americans and Laotians work in manufacturing. They're all essential workers who either were pivoted to make masks or PPE during the pandemic, or they were working in meat packaging plants. And all of this is just left out of the conversation because we have a pan-Asian identity and we have aggregated data collection that is being utilized to stop us from having a more nuanced conversation about the way that COVID-19 has, really inflicted harm on the different communities that make up our broader.
Thank you. So I want to leave room for questions. I'll ask one final question. It's been a heavy discussion. So, we've talked about the differences in our community, the need for us to really lift up, what's unique about each of the different communities, but also I think an acknowledgement that our fates are tied. And, as with other communities of color, we do want to do the work of building together. So what are some steps we can take, no matter where we come from in the AANHPI community, to build this community and further, whether or not it's an identity we need to further, what is the work we need to do together, and any actionable steps that we can mention would be helpful. Who wants to start? Okay, I'll assign somebody to start. Kieran, why don't we start with you? What do we need?
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing that comes to mind is really understanding each other's stories. And, the AANHPI umbrella, as we all discussed, is very large, and it comprises many communities with many unique stories. And yes, it's a sort of vehicle to garner political power and to organize under. But I think we need to not make the mistake of, that maybe others make, or which is to sort of lump all of us together. Com made the point earlier about data disaggregation, right? Which is so important, because when we look at all the data together, it tells a very different story than if you look at that data disaggregated, right? And I think not just data, but making time in spaces like these, in coalitions that we have and that we work together on, to really understand, the issues and the history and the perspectives of our different communities, so we can be advocates, where we have commonalities, but also where we don't, right? I mean, maybe it's something, for the Sikh American community that doesn't directly impact us, but we understanding and organizing under certain principles and wanting to give voice to minority communities, I think is, are reasons why we would stand up and advocate, for other communities, even when, issues don't, are not, don't directly impact us. And I definitely, I come away from this conversation, wanting to learn more here and wanting to continue my education and educate my community further about other stories as well.
Com, you want to go next?
Sure. There are so many steps, but I think one of the best steps that we can take to really build a more cohesive community is to be intentional about the way we include individuals and to how we include people. I think, you know, a lot of the exclusion is often just, it's often not intentional. I think, you know, when we are intentional about making sure that the different segments of our community are present, are represented, it allows us to make sure that the different voices are being represented in the conversations we have. So, you know, for us at CRAC, part of that is making sure that where we have access, we make sure that CINA at EPIC knows that we have access and that we can bring them along, or that we reach out to our partners at SALDEF or at SALT or at wherever, so that the entire community can be part of that conversation. So it's not just lip service ultimately. And I think, you know, we have been making progress, and I think we will continue to make progress. And I think it certainly looks much better now than it did 5 years ago. But I think we still have a long way to go. I think really just, you know, making sure that we're including people, that we're not, you know, excluding anyone if it's, you know, because there is enough space for all of us. And I think we have to make that space. And yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the most basic answer I can give. I can go into other stuff like colorism, but I'm not, maybe not today. But intentionality, I think, is.
Thank you, Kham. Sina, what can we do?
Yeah, I definitely think there has been progress. I think if I had to say one thing that folks could do, it would be to show up for us when we're not in the room. And all of you, Kham, Karen, and Seema, you have all done that for EPIC. And anytime anything comes up for us and we're kind of unsure, you three are literally the folks we think of first of like, hey, like, let's check in with Seema, with Karen, with Kham about this thing that we're like not totally sure on. And I think part of that is trust, right? I think another thing to think about is to build that trust with each other, because if it's not there, then it's not going to work. You know, and so Kham has been such a great ally to EPIC and just the PI community as a whole. And Seema, I'm totally enjoying my fellowship right now with community in the Capitol. So I think, yeah, I think just showing up for each other, and we try to do the same as well. So when I see something that is, you know, like that doesn't have any Southeast Asian representation or South Asian representation, like I flag it and I call it out, just because I know it's going to take all of us.
Thank you. Thank you all for all you do for our communities. You know, I think really through this challenging time, we have continued to build more trust among the different communities. And I think that's really what's holding our, you know, the community at large right now. So with that, we will move to some questions and answers. If folks have questions, please drop them in the Q&A box. We already have a few pending. Let me see. As social justice contributors, how do you personally navigate through the personal community setbacks or failures? How do you bounce back each time? That's a great question. It could get tiring. Now, what keeps you all going in this work you're doing that's so important? Kieran, why don't you start?
I was trying to think of my answer, so I was hoping you were going to call me first. That's okay. That's okay. I'll think of something. I'm trying to think of community setbacks and failures. I don't know that I have a great answer to this. It's just to try to keep on building. I was, you know, as I mentioned, I was on the ground for 10 days after the Indianapolis mass shooting, and I had a call with Valerie Kaur. I don't know if you guys are familiar. She's an activist in the Sikh community. And, you know, one thing we were talking about, she said, she had been in touch with folks there, and she said a lot of the shock and sort of the pain and sort of not knowing what to do in this situation was very similar to the mass shooting in Oak Creek, which happened in 2012. And we had a conversation, and just my first thoughts, which I shared with her at that time, was, we've been organizing for so many years. How can it be the exact same sort of confusion and not knowing what to do and not having the infrastructure in place and not having people that can provide in-language support? And I was obviously very upset about what happened, but also very frustrated in our organizing community, right? And I think it was just, for me, just saying, all right, well, you know what? Instead of look at what we haven't done, let's look at what we can do, and what we can do is build. And I I said to myself that day, we are going to build, and as long as I'm in this position, we're going to build the infrastructure, and I'm going to be committed to it. And so SALDEF, we have a sick lead program for sick youth leaders. We've actually started that program in Indianapolis. I had interviewed everybody and placed everybody in the last couple of months, and we opened the program in Indianapolis in the last, I would say, 2 weeks, which made my program manager pull out her hair a little bit, but I'm glad we have somebody on the ground that can help develop youth there. We've been in conversation with some of the other leaders there. We have a staff person from SALDEF who will be on the ground for a year, working in community in Indianapolis, and we're doing that, building infrastructure throughout the country. So our leadership program has expanded to 15 states this year, and I think just it's really, made me sit back and think, okay, well, we've got to do this. Things will happen. Unfortunately, there will likely be other mass shootings. There are likely going to be other hate crimes. I literally, I can't tell you how often I've been, in the middle of something, and we've had to drop everything because of, hate crimes or shootings against our community. But we've got to figure out a way to develop the infrastructure and just keep trying until we get it right.
Thank you. Sina, I think this question is important enough that we should all respond.
Yeah, I think one thing recently that one of my good friends, who's a activist, poet, a writer, her name is Teresa Siangatonu. She recently did a poem for, I believe, AAPI Rising, and it was really such a powerful video, and it was to wrap up a Heritage Month. And I think one thing that really stood out for me in her poem was, what kind of ancestor do I want to be? So that really resonated with me because, sorry, this is a lot of hard work, and I think sometimes it can get really hard. So just listening to that was what I needed, and just using that as fuel to continue.
Thank you. Come.
I wish my answer was as beautiful and healing as Sina's and Kieran's, but it isn't. Mine is pretty simple. I have a really great therapist, good whiskey, and I have really great community. That's what gets me through, quite honestly. When I have people who I can call community, who understand the work that we're doing together, so we can celebrate together, we can cry together when there are victories or when there are setbacks. I think last year my cousin passed, right? And I was like, I'm going to help move some of her goals, right? Because she was a school board member in Minnesota, and I was like, you know, I want to help keep her dreams alive. But ultimately, you know, it was that I have a great therapist. I had some really great whiskey, and I had a really great set of friends and community that were like, you know, like, we'll help do this with you. And I think the big part is really having that great community. And in the DMV, where there aren't that many Southeast Asians, I had a really great AANHPI community that came and coalesced around me and were like, we can do this together. And, you know, I think that's one of the beauties of the AANHPI identity, is being able to build broad community to come together regardless of where you're at.
Thank you. So let's see here. Thank you for those thoughtful responses. It's bringing me to many places myself, but I'm quite sure you will all be amazing ancestors. So Kham, in terms of the sense of community you talk about, maybe there, you've already mentioned a moment. You know, for others, this question is, you know, is there a singular moment or recent experience during which you felt that real sense of community? You know, whether it be with the AANHPR community at large, sorry, I still struggle with the language myself, or within your specific community. Any moment people want to share? Kieran, I'm going to keep putting you on the spot.
So the question is, when have we felt, you know, in community with the larger AANHPI?
Yes,
I think,
or within just the Sikh American or South Asian, you know.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple moments this year that I can point to. I mean, I feel like I keep using the Indianapolis shooting as an example. I can also add in the San Jose shooting if you would like. You know, I had members of different, you know, AANHPI groups reach out to see how they could support. I mean, that really meant a lot. We had sign-on letters. Even earlier this year, the community was dealing with the farmers' protest in India, which the diaspora was very, you know, invested in. You know, having conversations with other members of the AANHPI community and wanting, you know, them wanting to understand and be educated on some of these issues meant a lot. And I think most recently, I can tell you for SALDEF, I know there was, and I wasn't directly part of these conversations, so I might be getting it incorrect. I think there was a resolution that was going to be passed on the Atlanta shooting that was you know, that was going to be sort of presented. And, you know, there was conversations about, you know, whether or not there should be support from the other AANHPI, sorry, the acronym sometimes gets me, communities and organizations, because there wasn't a mention of Indianapolis. And I think that was like really, it was not expected certainly from our community, and wasn't expected from SALDEF. And we definitely wanted to support the experiences of all the other communities. And I think there was a decision to, instead of not support this resolution, to maybe create another resolution, which I believe we're working together on. I think that was really just I think that really hit me, and it really also, I think, hit members of the staff, and really, like, it was emotional, because I don't think it was ever an expectation. I mean, so many of our stories have been erased or not necessarily part of the main narrative for so long that there was just not an expectation that would even be a consideration. And the fact that it was, you know, I just really felt like, you know what, we are here and we're in coalition, and this is powerful. And really appreciated, you know, the support. And I would just echo Sina, I've appreciated, I've had, you know, conversations with all of you, and really appreciated those conversations, and you know, the support for the community. So thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Sina?
Just some things that I can think about recently. Our good friend Crystal Ka'ai, who is Native Hawaiian and Japanese, is the first person of Native Hawaiian descent to become the executive director of the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. It was pretty historical for our community because this is the first Native Hawaiian who has been appointed in this administration, and we were really proud of that, and we've always supported her. And I also know that was a lot there. She had a lot of support from just the broader AANHPI community as well. So I really appreciate that as well. And then I think just kind of like a turning point for me that I know I have to dig deep into more and do more homework on is CRAC had invited EPIC to an immigration meet with DS about a month or two ago, and it just made me like realize how much of a gap the immigration policy issue is in the Pacific Islander community, and not having a full grasp on it made me realize like that's a gap we need to fill. And I think I trust CRAC enough to know that they have our back, and vice versa, because I also know, what CRAC advocates for on immigration issues, it will benefit us too. So I was really inspired by that, and it's I started having conversations with my executive director about how do we approach this issue with our community, because it is a very different issue from all the other ones. And so we want to be really mindful and thoughtful about it, but we also know there needs to be advocacy on it. So, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a number of questions. I have to pick one here. Let's see. What do you consider to be the community's next big fight? Whether it's as an umbrella or of your respective communities, geographically or ethnically. What is next on the horizon for you and your communities? Who wants to take that one? Anyone clear on that? Com, you're smiling. I'm going to start with you.
At CRAC, we've been fighting to stop the deportations of Southeast Asian refugees for over 2 decades now. And I say that because I don't think there is a next fight. I think our communities have been fighting for the same thing for 2 decades. And I think those struggles continue. I think we've been pushing to disaggregate our data for 2 decades. We've been pushing for, more language access support for 2 decades. We've been pushing for better K-12, support for 2 decades. I think the fight continues. I think a lot of the issues, a lot of the big issues and big hurdles still persist, which is unfortunate. And I think, all that to say, I think that we are making much more cohesive strides towards trying to move our issues forward. And I think that's a lot of progress compared to where we were. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Yes, change takes time. And I think going back to post 9/11, it also occurred to me that our communities were so much more equipped for this moment, even though it didn't feel like it, I'm sure for many, than we were, 20 years ago. So there was real progress that was made, and we were much more organized and able to respond in this crisis, I think, as a broader community. So Sina or Kieran, either one of you want to respond to that question? What is the next big fight for?
I mean, I would sort of echo Com. I mean, I feel like a lot of the issues that are sort of on our, you know, the main focus that SALDEF has had over the years, they continue to be issues around, you know, civil rights, religious freedoms, hate crimes, immigration. I think we do have an opportunity now, you know, working in coalition and with the current climate and, you know, the focus on some of these issues to maybe move the needle forward. But I think that, you know, a lot of these issues are issues that the community has struggled with for decades, or if I want to be kind, and if maybe not over a century, you know, I mean, these are issues that have been around since coming to this country.
Okay, see, we have 10 more minutes. So this question is about the role of education in you know, sort of informing people about who our communities are. The question is, I've always believed that our history can provide context to the depths and persisting legacies of American colonization and imperialism. Illinois recently was the first state to pass legislation on that requires NHPI, well, and AAPI studies is what it says, which is great. How can this work? How can the dissemination of our history give more way to underrepresented voices and eliminate misperceptions and misconceptions that we are a monolithic community? And I know this is relevant on the national level as well. There is proposed legislation on this on the national level. So very timely question. Are any of your organizations working on this? Wanna start? Com, I know you're on our shared organizational committee on AANHPI, on the education committee. You wanna start?
Sure. So recently our California team, our California director helped write the Cambodian portions of the California Ethnic Studies curricula. And, you know, I bring this up because, you know, at CRAC, we firmly believe that ethnic studies is an integral component. Ethnic studies and Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander history is an integral component of everyone's education because they are also inherently American history and should be taught. I don't think it would necessarily move us away from the label of, you know, AANHPI. I think, again, that label has power and it is a political power that for, you know, why we use it. But I do think it helps in terms of educating, you know, our own communities and, you know, other communities about the diversity of the AANHPI community. I think it helps give more perspective. I think it helps, you know, other folks understand and give them more context for why our communities are here. I think, you know, the other thing that, you know, we firmly believe about ethnic studies is that it's important to curb violence. You know, we think that when people understand other people, they can better relate, they can better sympathize, and they can better be in community with them because they understand them. You know, we've seen this in our work with, you know, individuals who were gang members or who were, you know, in prison. And, you know, like oftentimes in prison, they learn about their own cultures and their own histories. They learn about civil rights. They learn about ethnic studies. And then they learn to be better people and they learn how to be better community members because they learn about what they have personally gone through and are able to contextualize their own experiences. So for us, I think part of it definitely gives power to, different communities to be able to feel more, represented, to have more visibility. But I think ultimately what it can do is help us better understand each other and help us better work together.
Thank you. Sina, you want to add anything in terms of the Pacific Islander community?
Yeah, I think very similar to what Com shared. Pacific Islander studies has been, it's something that we continue to fight for, specifically in California, but obviously, like we want that to be the standard everywhere. I think another thing to be mindful of too is that I think when we share, especially as an organization, when we get asked a lot of questions about like history, a lot of people are not prepared to hear it because there's so much truth to it, and I feel like it can be painful as well. I was on a call last month, and one of the folks on the call was Native Hawaiian, and to them, they don't think much of AAPI or AANHPI Heritage Month. It doesn't mean much to that person. So they said, I don't want this Heritage Month. I want my land back, right? And so when they said that, it made me pause and really think about where do I align with that? How do I align with that? Because it's part of history, right? And a lot of people don't fully understand what the historical contexts are, especially with each of our different islands, and especially with those who have, ties to the US as well. So I think it's really important to do your research and do the work and follow the lead of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander scholars who are telling these stories from their perspective and not from a white perspective.
Kieran, any final thoughts on this?
I mean, I would just echo Com and Sina. I think representation in our stories are so important. And I understand some of our stories are probably difficult or, hard to hear, but I think our communities have very unique experiences. We talked a lot about the broad AANHPI umbrella. I think it just really solidifies this idea that we're part of the American story. I mean, some of us, maybe chose more than others to be part of it, but I think that, it's incredibly important. I don't remember the specific question, so I don't know if I'm answering it completely, but I know it was around representation. So hopefully I addressed it.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it was around the role that history, learning each other's history really can play, and lifting up the voices of those that feel erased within the umbrella. I think grounding ourselves in history is a good place to end this, wonderful conversation. I feel like that is one of the most beautiful things that's emerged as a result of the recent, I would say, awakening around racial justice, is really this intentionality that is happening across the country among people that I would never have expected, that are really looking for answers and to learn the histories of our communities, of African Americans, indigenous populations in the US. So, I think that is really one of the most beautiful things that's emerged in the recent past. So I like to, we'll just sit with that. I think, National Capacity hosted its conference virtually last year, and we had this woman, Norma Wong, who is a native Hawaiian as well, who joined us. And, you know, she's very wise. And one of the things she really left with all of us was that it was important to pause in this moment and listen to this interruption. You know, and I think, you know, that has really stayed with me over the past year. And I think that's what grounding ourselves in history is really about. So I want to thank you all again for all you're doing and for this discussion. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. I'll ask our hosts at CAPAL to connect people to the right folks on our panel to respond to those. But really want to thank CAPAL for hosting us. I know I really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you to all the panelists. With that, I'll hand it off back to Billy.
Thank you, Seema. Thank you, Kam, Sina, Kieran, for your thoughtful conversation this evening. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. Before you log off, there are a few important pieces of information we would like to mention. So first of all, don't miss our upcoming events. Very important. Such wonderful events as you witnessed tonight. Next Wednesday, we have our second WLP session, From Niche Demographic to Defining Swing Voters, where we'll talk about the role of the AANHPI community in the 2020 election, particularly as a voter bloc in swing states and counties. Key topics of discussion include AANHPI voter participation, both historically and currently, AANHPI voter engagement and mobilization, as well as the growing power and voice of our community in politics. Key takeaways can include avenues in which to get involved in elections and grassroots organizing, as well as public service. Secondly, please check out our website on how to register and to view all of our upcoming programming. You can visit our website to learn more about us at capal.org. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We are out there and speaking to the community all the time. You can follow us at the handle @CAPALDC on Instagram, and I believe on Twitter as well. You can also find us on LinkedIn. We would like to take a moment to thank all of our 2021 sponsors as well for their continued support in our programs and helping us to continue to provide opportunities for AANHPIs in public service. Initially, this was an all-volunteer organization. CAPAL has served more than 600 scholars and interns over the last 30 years, and we've awarded over $360,000 of support to public service careers, both for undergraduates and graduate students. Our board members, scholars, and interns have gone on to serve as senior leaders across government, from the executive branch to legislative and judicial branches to federal and state and local levels, as well as in prominent policy and advocacy organizations. Your valued financial contributions help us expand this work. To donate, please visit capal.org. That funding is so important. We sincerely appreciate it. We also ask that you spread the word about our S&I program. Opportunities for undergraduate and graduate students open every year in November. So please consider if there are any AANHPI students you know or organizations who may be interested in working with us. Tell your University Career Center about us. If your organization is interested in sponsoring us, you can talk directly to our Managing Director, Shama Ahmed, for sponsorship opportunities. And finally, we're always trying to improve our programming to meet the needs and expectations of all of you, our community. So after you log off, there will be a short survey that should take you no more than 2 or 3 minutes to complete. Your honest feedback will be extremely valuable to our future programming, and your contribution is much appreciated. Thank you so much, everyone. We are in solidarity with all of you, and good night.